Hi, this is Debbie, and in today's video I'd like to take a look at the new Distress crayons from Tim Holtz. I linked to a video of Tim demonstrating the crayons and all their different properties. I was particularly interested in the fact that once distress crayons are dry, that they're able to resist distress inks. And I wanted to play around with that by applying some distress crayon through a stencil. However, let's first take a look at the distress crayons themselves. The crayon I have is the Picket Fence Distress Crayon. However, they will be coming out in packs of 6 of different colourways. I think there's 3 sets that they're bringing out. The packaging is similar to a lipstick. You screw it from the bottom and the crayon comes out the top. And it's a very soft pliable texture. You're able to rub it through a stencil, and once you apply it, there's a certain amount of smudge time, I think it's called, where you can actually move the crayon around before it dries. This Picket Fence colourway certainly shows up against the black of this cardstock, and surprisingly to me there's also quite a lot of texture when you've rubbed the crayon through a stencil. Now I do like my soft muted tones, so this is using the same crayon through the bubble stencil and onto fog card. This time I apply the crayon over a larger area, and having given it a good rub in, I then remove the stencil, and you can see better here the texture and the lovely background that you get. As I mentioned previously, when you first apply the crayon there's a certain amount of smudge time. Then once it dries it becomes stable and you can apply other media over the top, such as distress inks. So I'm using the same bubble stencil and I'm rubbing the crayon through the stencil in the same way as I did before, and this time it's onto watercolour cardstock. And again you get that lovely raised texture and pattern from the crayons. Now you can leave the crayons to dry, or equally as they're heat stable you can use your heat gun to help the drying process. Now that the crayon is dry and stable, you're able to use even an ink blending tool. These crayons aren't going to move now that they're dry, and you can bring in distress inks over the top. I'm using a combination of dried marigold, picked raspberry and tumbled glass distress inks, slowly blending them in across the background. Once the blending's finished, I'm then going to squirt the panel with some water, and this will help the colours to blend together more. And I'm also going to splatter on some water, which will give some highlights within the colour. The distress inks will move away from the water and you'll get white highlights where the water splatters have been. I'm also going to splatter on some Perfect Pearl solution. Now this is a solution I use quite a lot, so I thought I'd show you how I make it up. Simply pour a small amount of water into a mini mister and add a couple of scoops of Perfect Pearls, and then give that a really good shake up, and then when you splatter this onto a project it gives lovely sparkly white highlights to your project. Before I move on to making a card, I just thought I'd summarise where we got to so far. So the Distress Crayon, it works really well, this Picket Fence colour, against the black card. It gives a lovely muted background against fog card, and also you get the lovely colourful way that you can get the Distress Crayon to resist distress inks. As far as cleaning up, I found that all I needed to do was rub over the stencil with a damp cloth, and that removed all the crayon. I'm going to move on to making a card with one of the pretty distress ink backgrounds, and I'm going to use the heart banner die from Simon Says Stamp. I'm going to cut the die twice from some watercolour cards, more of the same watercolour card, and I'm going to keep the outline without colour. I'm going to keep that as a white outline, and then I'm going to use distress inks to colour some of the hearts. I've trimmed the banners to fit the panel, and now I'm going to get on with watercolouring those hearts. I'm going to use the same distress ink colours that I used for the background, so picked raspberry, dried marigold and tumbled glass, and I'm applying a little of the distress ink to an acrylic block and then picking up the colour with some water and colouring in the hearts. Once the first layer was dry, I also went back in and added a second layer before splattering the hearts with some of the Perfect Pearl solution. I also coloured a scrap of watercolour card with a couple of layers of picked raspberry distress ink, dried that and then ran it through my die cutter with a Big U die from Simon Says Stamp. Now this is the matching stamp set that is called Big U Words, and I'm going to use that Are Fantastic sentiment. I'm going to heat emboss the sentiment, so to prevent any powder sticking where I don't want it to, I firstly treated the paper with some EK Success powder tool, and then used Versamark ink and the Misty stamping tool to stamp the sentiment, giving it a really good press down, and I actually double stamped it to hopefully counteract the fact that the watercolour card is quite textured and I wanted to get a good impression. I've then sprinkled on silver embossing powder from Simon Says Stamp and then heat set that. I've worked out where I want everything placed, and now it's time to get them all adhered. I'm using range mild to medium in matte, which means that if any of the glue squidges out it will dry matte and won't be visible. and I'm using a T-square ruler to help me align everything so that it goes on straight. Again, I've used multi-medium in matte with the fine applicator to put little dots of glue onto the back of the heart banner dies. I'm using little pieces of foam adhesive on the back of the watercoloured hearts so that these are raised up slightly from the heart banner dies. To accent, I've picked out a range of sequins, and again I'm applying those with range multi-medium in matte. Finally, I've added lots of foam adhesive to the back of the watercolour card and applying that to a top folding card base made from more of the watercolour card. I hope you've enjoyed this first look at the Tim Holtz Distress Crayons. I'll leave some links down below in the YouTube description to the products I've used today and also to the video of Tim demonstrating the crayons. I'll also leave a link to my blog post where there'll be more photographs and details of today's project. Finally, if you've enjoyed today's video and want to see more from me, then I'd be delighted if you consider subscribing to my channel. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.